hosting and chairing today's discussion that we've entitled International River Basins, Mapping Institutional Resilience to Climate Change. We are very fortunate to have one of our recidivists, one of our returning prodigal sons too strong, one of our good friends, one of our water gurus, Aaron Wolf, coming back to the center for, I don't know, I've lost track of how many times. As I think many of you know, Aaron and his colleagues, and he's very good at working with colleagues, and we have two of them here on the podium as well, Matt Zentner and Jim Duncan, in really giving us the baseline foundational hard work that goes into understanding how states interact over water. And I think many of you know that his path-breaking work from their Transboundary Dispute Water Database and their Basins at Risk work really has set the stage for our understanding of how states interact around water from a conflictual and from a cooperative perspective. And so it was a terrific opportunity for us to take advantage of him spending some time in Washington this week to have him come talk about, again, with his collaborators and co-authors, some research that was originally done for the World Bank and will be forthcoming in peer review literature that really looks at some of these questions of resilience and vulnerability and variability and connecting water and climate change, something that we hear a lot about climate change in this town, not always bringing it down to what it means in specific places and how it affects specific resources. And Aaron and his colleagues are doing that for us in ways that I think are very productive, and so we wanted to have them share their work with all of you, and so we can have a conversation and go forward. We have some new faces, so just allow me to say for a moment, we're sitting at the Wilson Center, the formal memorial to Woodrow Wilson, founded in Congress in 1968 as a nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum to bring the worlds of research and policy together, what we're clearly trying to do here today. Our environmental change and security program is a younger program, but we're now in our 17th year, trying to bridge these worlds of natural resources, environment, development, health, population, and understand them in broader foreign and security policy contexts. And so many of those themes we're touching on very directly today. Today's session is part of our Resources for Peace project, which is a collaboration and partnership with USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. It's great to see Neil Levine here, Cynthia Brady is here, and it's been wonderful working with them and other colleagues at AID and within USG and around town on trying to, again, be productive in understanding these links, parsing them out, and then importantly taking the additional steps of having dialogue with the practitioners and the policymakers so that we can translate some of our understanding into practical responses with different tools. Obviously, even just looking around the room, we have very different toolboxes that we bring to the table. And so our ability to talk across those communities is exactly what we're trying to do with this forum. And so we appreciate very much that we have the opportunity to do this, both for those of us in the room and also those who are watching the webcast live, and then the video will be archived on our website. So we urge you to point your friends and colleagues in the direction of that if you feel they will benefit from today's discussion. I'm going to keep their introductions very short in terms of the bios because those are available for you out front. Aaron's going to kick us off. He's a professor of geography at Oregon State University. I've told you a little bit about some of the work that he's done from the research perspective. He's also been very much an in-the-room water negotiator, facilitator, so this is somebody who very effectively bridges the worlds of scholarship and the worlds of practice with a variety of consultancies with the U.S. government, with international organizations, with communities and states, and down at very state level. We had a very interesting conversation, for example, about that contentious transboundary basin in the Columbia River and the U.S.-Canada relation, so and what that means on very local levels and national. So he's someone who brings quite a lot of experience to this discussion. It's terrific to have Aaron back. Jim Duncan is working now as a consultant for the World Bank, where he's developing interactive mapping platform on extractive industries in Ghana. And I know we have some Ghana expertise here in the room. Ed Carr, it's good to see you. But is kind of, in some ways, an extension of some of the work that he's done, this paper that, as I said, today's discussion is based on. And Matt Zentner is a hydrologist at the Department of Defense and has had the good fortune of the U.S. government seeing it as valuable to give time and opportunity to go and interact and do a PhD and work closely with leading scholars while still bringing that that practical research into a specific policy and security community context. So it's great to have Matt here as well. So Aaron, I think you're kicking us off. We'll turn the floor over to you and look forward to the conversation.
This one, check, no?
I swore I turned it on.
I'll probably turn it off. Yep, there we go. Yeah, I appreciate it. They know here that I can't sit down and talk at the same time, so always give me the accoutrements. I really appreciate being here in Washington. Although every time I come, I have to relearn how to tie a necktie. They're not allowed in Oregon, and so it's actually sometimes works to your disadvantage because any facilitators in the room, people who facilitate. So, okay, so one of the tricks is when you walk in, you want to give everybody a sense that you're just going to relax. So one of the tricks of a facilitator is you walk in with a jacket and tie, and then you make a big production out of taking off your jacket and tie so everybody else will do the same.
Can we
so
do
first,
that today?
one of the first, absolutely, feel free here. So one of the first meetings in the Pacific Northwest I was involved with, I walked in and I went to do this, and I looked, there wasn't a tie in the place. It was absolutely ineffective. So, all right. So it's a real pleasure, as always, to when Jeff asks, the answer is yes, regardless of what it is. But it's always a joy to be here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's a particular joy to be here with two former students, and that's those of us who are educators or who have interns or who have people who work with us. The real joy in this work is to work with them for a while. And then watch as they go off and do way cooler stuff than they were doing at OSU. And they still have to talk to you because you're their former advisor. So you'll get a sense of Jim and Matt's expertise. And this is all work that what you're going to see comes out of a larger project that we did from OSU with the World Bank, and then from Matt's PhD dissertation, then work that we've all been doing subsequent. So this is our basic. I need to start kind of the International Waters 101. Do it really, really quickly. But our basic problem is this. Water people see watersheds like this image on the left. We see only the watershed boundaries. We see the things that unite us, the things that bring us together. We know everything's connected to each other. Surface water, quality, quantity, everybody who lives in the basin, all the wildlife that lives in the basin, it's all connected and it's all brought together. So these are the forces that bring us together. And then people who think about politics see the basin this way on the right. See the political boundaries, the economic sectoral boundaries, see all the things that divide us. And for a long time, we tried to persuade each other that our view of the world was right until we finally recognized that both views are right. These boundaries are here for very legitimate reasons, protecting economies and sovereignties and so on. And this is also correct. But what we then have to do in international waters or any water that crosses boundaries is figure out how to balance these two sets of interests, both the things that bring us together and the things that separate us. Today's focus is on transboundary international waters. So these are the basins that cross the boundaries of 2 or more countries. There's quite a lot. There's 276 international basins. It's half the land surface of the Earth. 40% of the world's population lives within these basins, and interestingly, 80% of the world's fresh water originates in basins that are shared by 2 or more countries. So there's a lot of discussion about how precisely countries go about managing these relations when their water resources cross international boundaries. And some of those international boundaries aren't particularly friendly. When we're talking about shared basins, we're talking about Israelis and Arabs, Indians and Pakistanis, Azeris and Armenians. And around the world, we're faced with this set of questions. To manage the water efficiently, we need to do it cooperatively. How does that happen? And how does it happen particularly in tense basins? One of the things that we tried to do years ago, because there was so much anecdotal evidence, is just collect stuff. That's, if we have a claim to fame, it's that we collect stuff and we count it. And that turns out to be useful when a lot of the rhetoric was really anecdotal. There's going to be wars about water. There's going to be violence. There's so much information. The bottom line, there was almost no systematic collection 20 years ago when we first started getting involved in this. So we started collecting stuff. Started collecting treaties. We have the largest collection, 688 treaties that deal with transboundary waters, all the U.S. compacts, negotiating notes, annotated bibliography. And one of the things that we did, if we're famous for a figure, or if not famous, the water world's about this big, we have to be honest, but if there is a figure that's known, it's this one, because when we counted stuff, some interesting things started to come out of it. One of the things we did is look over the last 50 years at any time two countries did anything over water. Question is, what did they do? And there's a whole spectrum, a conflict cooperation spectrum of things they can do. They can cooperate, they can do nothing, they can conflict, they can go to war. And we didn't know because everybody at the time was talking about the tensions and the coming wars and so on. So when we actually collected, was it 1,800 events at the time? It's now, I don't know, 2,400 events or something like this. Regularly, we see that at any scale, 2/3 of the time we do anything over water, it's cooperate. That's really useful to know. How is it? And these are the same people who don't like each other very much. These are Israelis and Arabs, Indians and Pakistanis, Azeris and Armenians, figuring out ways to cooperate over their shared water. And the conflict side is 80% verbal conflict. This is people talking about conflict, journalists writing about conflict, politicians saying there's going to be conflict. But actual conflict turns out to be very rare. 37 cases, 27 of these are between Israelis and Arabs, and no wars at all. You have to go back 4,500 years to find an actual war over water between two countries. The reason this is important is because we now have something that we can start to test the relationship between conflict, cooperation, and the things that create settings for these kinds of things, which is where we actually wanted to go today. A number of years ago, we were asked, what are the indicators of conflict, evidence-based indicators that you can use to suggest places that are going to be conflictive in the next 3 to 5 years? And we thought about the things that we normally hear that are going to cause conflict. Number one, scarcity. We assume that when you run out of something, you're going to fight to get more of it. The other things we thought, population growth, water stress, level of development, dependence. These are the things intuitively, if you thought, what could lead to areas of stress in the future. And then we did a study, and this is the one that Jeff alluded to, 2003, this Basins at Risk study. This was led by Shira Yaffe. She's now, she's not at state. She's, I think, in forestry, right? Forest. Really smart student, helped us think. And what we did is we did a big GIS, a Geographic Information System, of all the things we think might indicate conflict, tested them against our event data to see what actually did. And sure enough, none of the things that we thought statistically led to conflict. In fact, statistically, nothing indicates anything anywhere about anything. That was basically our finding. Until we finally realized that we were looking at it, we were trying to look at things at change and conflict by itself. And one of the triggers that really got us thinking in a different way was that the arid climate, which you would assume would be the most conflictive, was actually the most cooperative. And all of a sudden, the little light bulb goes off, and I can see a lot of you are going, duh, of course, right? Why? Aridity leads to institutions to help manage aridity. Right? You don't need cooperation in a humid climate. So that was suddenly the point where we started to think, wait a second, it's not just about change in a basin, it's about the relationship between change and the institutions that are developed to mitigate the impacts of change. And so the likelihood of conflict, of tension goes up when the rate of change in a basin exceeds the institutional capacity to absorb the change. And that's become our working hypothesis ever since. And that's important to understand as we move into today's talk. What does this mean? There's floods and droughts in a basin. There's population growth. There's economic growth. All this stuff is happening. If it's happening between, say, the US and Canada, where we have tremendous institutional resilience. We have treaties going back to 1909. We love each other. We cooperate over everything. Sometimes we forget there's a border. Well, we forget there's a border. Canadians never forget there's a border. Between the two, that's not likely to lead to tension. If you take that same change and you put it in a basin where there's hostility, where there are no treaties, where there's suspicion of the motives of the other, now you're in a more conflictive setting. Okay? So understanding that, we're able to look, and this is the map we developed at the time, these basins, what we called basins at risk, where we saw plans, development plans in these basins that conflicted with the development plans of others, and there was no agreement in place to mitigate for those. So the concept, we think, holds true, the relationship between change and institutions, but the basins, of course, have changed. There's been a lot of building institutional capacity precisely in these basins, which all is preamble to what we want to talk about today. This study, this was led by Lucia Di Stefano, who was a postdoc with us. Jim was on this, Shlomi Dinar, Kirsten Stahl, Ken Sturzbeck, and cooperating also with Matt and others. Huge number. I have to right up front say, there's a lot of people who helped on this work. And I urge you, there's a website that gets you to the study. Look at the acknowledgement section to see all the folks who really kicked in. And what we had to do in order to think about the relationship, particularly between hydrologic variability and institutions, we had to step up our game in terms of data. We had done all our assessments, as most of the world had, based on river basins. Right? So you talk about the Nile. How many treaties are there on the Nile? That's important, but what's even more important is if you break basins up into the parts of a basin within a different country, now you can get a much finer scale and do some assessments. So we know there's a good treaty, well, an old treaty, between Sudan and Egypt on the Nile, but not on the other 8, now 9 riparian states. So we had to break up, and instead of thinking about basins as a whole, start to think in terms of basin-country units, right? So picture, for example, the Columbia Basin. There's a part of the Columbia in the US. There's a part of the Columbia in Canada. These are the things that we're doing. And so the first thing we had to do was break up our base map. Second thing we wanted to think about was variability. The question is the relation between hydrologic variability and institution. So here, working with Ken Sturzbeck at the University of Colorado, he helped us downscale hydrologic variability to the basin country units that we're looking for. So these reds are basins with a lot of variability. The Jordan, for example, 40% above and below the mean in any given year, and a number of these basins less variable. And then we had to step up our treaty game. We had to go out and collect more treaties, which is fun. Then we had to read the treaties, which is less fun. And what we find right off the bat, and Jim's going to go into a little bit more detail, 276 international basins. Of those, 86 have more than 2 countries associated with it. The percent of basins with at least 1 treaty is about 40%. Percent of bilateral basins, it's only 30%. This is interesting. So here you think, oh my gosh, we really don't have a lot of treaty coverage. Number of transboundary basins, the percent of transboundary area that's covered by basins, almost 70%. So even though there are very few basins by number, actually quite a lot of the world of transboundary waters is covered by treaty, and the percent of population covered by treaty is actually almost 80%. So a lot of different ways to look at these questions. And we had to go through and code what do each of the treaties deal with. And so we're looking for things that help mitigate for variability. We're looking for allocation mechanisms. Only a quarter of the treaties have allocation mechanisms. Only 5% of treaties designate river basin organizations. A third have some kind of joint management. A fifth are for hydropower. Only 5% deal with groundwater explicitly. This is the source that most of the world relies on for water resources. Only a third have conflict resolution mechanisms. So there's a lot of treaties, but they're not very comprehensive, and they don't generally do a good job of dealing with the things that we need to deal with if we're thinking about variability. So then we kind of figured out what are those things that help us deal with variability. And it's things like understanding allocations, a variability management mechanism, a conflict resolution mechanism, or ideally, there's actually a river basin organization that can manage. So think about rivers fluctuating. You need some subset of these, and ideally most of these, to help deal with variability. And we went through, and I think Jim will come back and look at this in a little bit more detail. Again, different conflict resolution mechanisms on different continents. But here we have now, of our Basin-Country Units, this is now how well or poorly they can deal with variability, at least according to the treaties that they've signed. And so you see quite a lot of red where there's no treaty at all. Quite a lot of orange where they have only one of the things that we think can help us deal with variability. And some green, particularly in Europe and North America, but not in a lot of the rest of the world, which means there's a lot of variability going out there that doesn't have the capacity or the institutional capacity to deal with it. All this is really important for today, and I really want to stress this. Climate change is in the title. Climate change we see as an exacerbator to an already bad situation. A lot of the world currently can't deal with the variability that they have today. And we're seeing the results of this in a lot of different ways, certainly Eastern Africa right now, the floods along the Indus last year. This is really important. It's happening now. It's a major set of issues now. We want to look into the future, but we want to remind people, let's also come back to today and step back and say, if we know this is a problem, let's try and deal with the issues of the day. Why is it useful to look into the future? Take the rivers that come out of the Himalayas, huge number of not just number of rivers, but 1.5 billion people. 1.5 billion people rely on the water that come out of the Himalayas. And we're talking about all Southeast Asia, all the way up into the Caucasus. And most of the population, of course, is south of the Himalayas. And naturally, most of the treaties are south of the Himalayas. But there are big blocks, if we break down by country unit, there are big blocks that don't have any treaties now to deal with current variability. And so if we look into the future, this is current variability. So most of these rivers aren't wildly variable. Monsoon's fairly stable. The combination of the monsoon and the snowmelt helps balance out a certain amount of the variability. But if we look at what the climate models are saying in the future, there's going to be increasing variability in precisely the parts of the Himalayas where there is no treaty coverage. Okay? So this is why it's useful to think, let's start with today, let's look at the variability today, let's look at the vulnerability today, and see how we can't help enhance resilience so that as we come to the problems of tomorrow, we'll be able to deal with them better. Thanks very much.
So I want to thank you all for being here, and thank you, Aaron, for a great introduction to this topic. I'm going to kind of take two approaches here. We're going to be diving a little bit into the methodology, but I want to talk some about the climate piece and then give you some of the most recent findings we've actually gotten from some of this deeper treaty analysis that we're doing that can start to answer some of these now questions. What is the state of the transboundary water law now? So I'll talk a little bit about what we did to refine and expand the TFDD, some of the preliminary findings that we got from that database as we're starting to look more deeply into what these data tell us, and then come back to the idea of what these institutional arrangements mean for climate change risks. So first thing we were able to do, again, is map treaty coverage. This is a slightly different map than the one you saw before, because this shows kind of the density of treaty coverage. So hatched areas are no treaties. You can see some really dense areas in South America, around the Himalaya, but all in all, there's variability not only across the world, but within basins. And I think that that's one very powerful tool, tool that we've gotten out of this analysis is we can look at what are the disparities within a basin. Under our climate modeling, we actually saw some places that are pretty well known, the Rhine, the Elbe, the Indus, have really large disparities in treaty coverage for climate change mechanisms of 5. Like some parts have 0, some parts have 5. And that kind of disparity is something that we weren't able to see before. So I wanted to point that out. Also, we tend to see that the types of mechanisms that are being incorporated vary around the world. We saw a lot less coverage in South America of a wide range of mechanisms. So you might have a lot of treaties, but they all deal maybe with 1 or 2 types of mechanisms, such as joint management or allocation. Whereas in places like Africa, we were seeing a more wide distribution of that. So another thing that we did is we introduced a lineage concept, and as far as we can tell, this is the first time that's been there. We combined, say, a primary agreement that establishes a certain treaty in a basin. And that might have an amendment, it might have a protocol, and these things might have different components. The amendment might add joint management to a treaty. We can combine that into one instrument and then analyze that group together. And I think this is interesting because it actually changes the distribution a lot. As Dr. Wolf was showing, we see maybe only a third of the treaties have joint management as documents signed. If we look at them as groups, it's almost 60%. So there's this real transition when you start to group things in together. And I think it generally everything goes up, but we also see some things that aren't still very prevalent, like groundwater. Still only 6% at documents, only 14% when you do instruments. So we're still not seeing much coverage in the treaties for that. And what this has allowed us to do is, I don't know why those are there, look at some of the temporal evolution, some of the spatial evolution. So we can see there's a lot of treaty formation happening as we enter the 19th century, and there are definite peaks of formation and large areas that all of a sudden come into being covered by treaties. So we've started to look into that, and we've also started to look into some of this depth of content. We saw this conflict resolution data. You can see that there are some that are just more common in treaties than others. We can also break it down by geographic distribution and start to see where there are patterns. For example, a real difference in third-party involvement, permanent judicial organ aren't as common and also show up in different continents relative to other types of conflict resolution. So all of this is a great way to say that we have a lot more information. We're starting to work on it now. And we see overall treaty distributions by continent and in total. You do see a lot more multilateral formation. And I think one thing that's interesting about looking into the multilateral situation is you have all of these basins, as was mentioned, that are multilateral, have multiple riparians, but they don't include treaties that include all riparians. So while we look at it at first pass, we see, okay, it looks like multilateral coverage is good. When you actually look at the completeness of that coverage, it drops pretty low. Only 13% of the world's transboundary basins that are multilateral have a complete multilateral treaty, and that's something that is going to might be a challenge going forward. Similarly, looking at basin scale management, so this idea that we think basin scale should be the way to go, it's definitely increasing, but overall coverage is pretty low, and I'm looking for my number here, but I don't have it. But suffice it to say that we're seeing about 25% of the world having a basin scale management scheme in place through their treaties. We might see some that are focusing on a specific sub-basin or saying all of our shared waters are going to be covered in a certain way, but that specific basin scale management piece is still in process. So coming back to the treaties and climate change. We have all this information. We have an idea of where there might be climate risk coming. So what is this distribution? And we saw the map before that shows us how these mechanisms for climate change are distributed. And then what basins may merit further study based on when we mash those together with this climate information. So to get into the methodology a little bit, we used a vulnerability hazard risk framework. So vulnerability was institutional factors. Hazard was the hydrologic factors, and you can combine them in a rating model to rate risk from highest down to lowest, and start to look at what basins start to pop out, what BCUs, what basin country units start to pop out after that. So we took two different approaches. If you've looked at the World Bank report, we have one where we looked at just the present variability. We have one looked at only the change in variability in the future. Then we have a forthcoming in the peer review version, a combination of the two. So where is variable already or kind of variable and is going to see an increase? So we wanted to kind of separate out those two. This just shows you in a map form how we did it. You have your vulnerability combined with a hazard level, gives you a risk map. So when you see the maps, that's kind of the result that you're seeing. Future variability was defined with a suite of climate models. I'm going to skip that little bit of specifics because you either already know or you don't really care. So we can talk about that later if you want. I'm happy to talk climate models. But this just shows you what we have as projected conditions in 2030 and projected conditions in the 2050 range. So it tells us a little bit about what's the year-to-year variability and what's the change, right? So you may have not had much variability, but you might see a high degree of change. And so this targets us to look at basins, not because it's not the actual variability, but it's the magnitude of departure from what they're experiencing now that's going to be really critical. So this just filters out and looks only at the high present variability and what the different risk classes are based on the vulnerability. So we can see there's a concentration in Africa. And you can see within those BCUs, there's a real difference in whether they have good treaty coverage, moderate, or low. When we switch to 2050, and looking just at the future change, that second level definition of hazard, you can see a much wider spread. And also the spread of vulnerability levels changes quite significantly too. So we have some areas in Southeast Asia, we have Central Europe, we have other places that are starting to pop out as potentially interesting. It doesn't mean that there's going to be conflict here, there's going to be problems, but these are places we might want to think about. And looking at this kind of combined mix method where we look at, are you moderately vulnerable now or moderately variable now and going to be much and see some change, we can see different basins popping out. And you see a lot of these ones on the fringes. So this just gives us a different picture. And all of this is to say, none of this is definitive, but this is a way that we can start using this data to look for some of these hazards. So what we did then is filtered our results, and this just gives you kind of a table version of what we found. This looks for pieces of basins that are contributing equally, because some might be a little sliver with 2 people living there, 1 raindrop falls a year, and it's 5 square miles. We don't really care about that. We want to know which ones are actually contributing substantially to the basin. So we ran a filter that kind of identified these more equal distribution ones, and these are the ones that popped out, both based on their present and future variability. Some we can see that we might already be concerned about, the Niger, the Congo, Lake Chad. But then we have a number of other ones that aren't even in Africa, that aren't necessarily, I had never heard of until we did this analysis. So I think it's an interesting start. And you can see there are some where you have disparities in treaty RBO scores, some where nobody has a treaty, so it's 0-0. So this is kind of a first pass, and it encompasses about 11 million people, and that's not a lot in global terms, but some of these are really high density areas, like this basin piece in Turkey has a density of about 100 people per square kilometer. So the actual potential human impacts from climate change, even in these small places, could be pretty significant. This just shows you in map form kind of what we were able to do in terms of identifying these basins. And coming kind of to what this means from going forward, we can kind of take a step back. Variability management, that was one of our key pieces that we were interested in using to rate institutional capacity. We're seeing that we can now start to break that down further, because variability management can be flood control, it can be dry season control, it can be both. And what we're seeing is over half of the treaties that have ever been signed deal with variability only in terms of flood control. And we're only seeing about 15% that deal with dry season control. Yet we know that this might be one of the, the climate change tends to favor that side of impact. And so we can start to look at that. We can also look at types of allocation mechanisms. The treaty database actually breaks down into different types of allocation. Is it everyone gets 500 cubic feet? Is it everyone gets 50% of the river? Do you do it by consultation every year? So these kinds of direct and indirect mechanisms for allocating water. We see that direct mechanisms are 3 times as common as indirect mechanisms. So we can start to look more into what, okay, we have, is it there or isn't it? This institution, now we can look at what does that institution look like. Another key finding of this is that these disparities could play a real role. We mentioned the Indus before in terms of flood. You have two basin-country units within that basin that have a different treaty coverage than the others or the other three, and so that might be an area that we need to focus on is better basin-wide coverage. And then also these new distributions of risk. We're seeing risk spread into areas that we hadn't always thought that they would be before. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt. Right one.
I work for the Department of Defense right now, but what I'm going to talk about are water issues according to Matt, and not according to water issues according to the Department of Defense or the U.S. government. Talked to the folks before I came out here, and they said that I had to make that announcement here for everyone. So we've talked about treaties and why they're important, and the risk of conflict, and why people might in the future rely on these treaties perhaps more than they already do. I think it's important, though, to talk about a little bit and think about, well, why do governments care? What is it about the water that people care about? I mean, generally speaking, it's not really the water so much that people are willing to fight over, but it's the issues that are associated with that cause people to have disagreements. So if we look at water and what it's for and where it comes from, for example, this right here is just an example of India. This is their total amount of water. Up at the top is drinking and sanitation water, and then underneath that is everything else, industry, agriculture, and everything else that goes along with it. So I think when I imagine water, I tend to think along these lines, and I think that's what most people think about is sanitation, water. We need to get water to the people. We need to give them sanitation. Well, in reality, that's not really necessarily what governments care about. Water is really a junior ministry. It's not really one that people tend to think of as one of the core places that power resides within a country, and so you can really should probably think about that 20 gallons or 40 gallons differently than the rest of the water. That can pretty much be separated and fall under the human security realm of things. So, but what I like this quote down here is that when you tug at something in nature, you find it attached to the rest of the world. And I think what happens when people really start caring about water is when it starts impacting these other ministries, these other areas of importance that really start impacting what we would consider really national security. So when it starts impacting economic growth, people pay attention. When it starts impacting food availability, electric power, your relations, land rights, those kind of things are what really drive people to pay attention to treaties and can potentially cause them to have disagreements. So what is water security? Well, it really depends on who you ask. If you ask a farmer, he definitely has a definition of water security. I have a different definition. A politician has a different definition. It just depends on what their interests are. So not all of those human security concerns rise to the national security level just because everybody has a different definition of national security. Generally speaking, within most countries, water just resides at that. Well, let me go back. I'm sorry, I apologize. So we have that when we have talking about human security. We're gonna define that as the small s security, and when you're talking about larger national security issues, we're gonna call that the big S security. And that'll be throughout the presentation. So I wanted to make that clear. So, so when we're talking about countries and what do they care about, water, and why would they care about treaties? Generally speaking, water resides at that small s security for most countries. There are some exceptions. If you look at these graphs of GDP and rainfall, you can see that there's definitely a correlation for some countries between their overall economic strength and rainfall. So it's very important to those countries. So generally speaking, it's countries that have agricultural-based economies and are generally developing countries. So if you look at precipitation in the United States, for example, GDP, you're going to see a very different correlation. GDP is not going to have any correlation at all with rainfall. Okay, so when I think of national security, we've talked about water wars, and I think that's what generally people say is, water security or national security wars. But in reality, with water, there is a strong element to national security. It's just more subtle than water wars, as you would put it. I kind of tend to think of it as more like cold water wars. If you think about some of the relations that aren't exactly classified as war, but there still is there's disagreements. And sure, countries definitely recognize the inherent power that they might have within water, and definitely they utilize it. So anything that impacts that geopolitical, military, economic, or social cohesion can be considered part of national security. And water can definitely cause shifts in relative wealth or power, can definitely exert influence, can be used as a tool, can definitely be used to impact state stability, and can be used as an implicit threat. Dr. Perscoli actually I can't take credit for this over here on this side right here, but if you look at this Chinese character down here, and in Japanese, I'm not sure exactly how you say it in Chinese, but in Japanese it's G, G, which is it's government. And if you take river and dike, you get political order or government. And there's another interpretation of this. This can be also again, I'm not sure exactly what the Chinese version, but in Japanese, this can be water, and this is personal. So your personal water, and this is your mouth, equals, it's more of like a passivity. It's just being at peace with things. So if you have water for your mouth, you're at peace with things. So there's definitely a relationship between national security and what people care about with water. And frankly, I've been extremely happy recently. This is a newer phenomenon, but people are starting to make this connection between water and not necessarily thinking just human security, which sometimes, that big, small s, which sometimes does reach up to that larger s level. But people are making that connection to all of the other issues that water impacts. One of the champions and the people who are thinking along those lines is Secretary of State Clinton, who has requested a national intelligence estimate to look at those relationships, and also is increasingly using it not just in the overall intelligence, but also in our foreign policy. So it's really refreshing that we're actually starting to see these relationships and understanding the importance of water. So I wanted to talk a little bit about current stresses and where we are and where we might be going into the future as well. So if you look at water availability, there's these references that they have their place, but they can also be a little bit misleading as well. If you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo over here, as far as water availability, here's your stress and scarcity levels right here. Looks like, hey, D-Rock is doing great. Everybody's happy in D-Rock with their water. They've got lots of water, they really do. And then you look over at UAE, and oh my goodness, people are dying of thirst over there. We better do something right away. Well, so it's not just the water availability. There's other things that go into that, economic scarcity, being able to develop your water resources, being able to distribute your water resources. All of that goes into play. So it's not a simple, oh my goodness, we're at this level, we cross over that, and we better you want to watch out. Things are going to happen in that country. It's a lot more complicated because you have all of those other factors that go into it. All right, so in the past, there really haven't been major conflicts, but there are reasons for being concerned. The future might not exactly look like the past, and especially just from a purely water availability standpoint. So one of the major stresses, world population up by 1 billion or so by 2025. Requirements for a broad range of reasons that we'll talk about here for just a second, up by 40%. And then we do talk about the climate change issues and the overall water availability there. But just as important as these water stresses is, as far as the overall amounts, is getting the water at the right time at the right places. So a lot of the changes that we're going to see are changes in timing and being able to get the water to particular locations. So one of the major stresses is going to be food availability. It's our largest consumer of water. Demands are increasing for a broad range of reasons. Higher standards of living equals more consumption of water, either usually in a virtual sense. And then also our land availability for growing land for growing food is decreasing as well. So this also has implications as far as having food also equals stability, and those countries that have that water invested within their or available to them are going to have increased food, and also which equates to increased economic strength and stability as well. And the countries, vice versa, countries that don't have that water will have an increased risk of instability from a food angle as well. The food crisis of the last couple of 2 years ago didn't really impact us per se. We didn't really notice. We paid maybe a few more dollars, but it definitely impacted Africa, and several countries within that had severe impacts. Water and energy, we don't think necessarily about water or energy being a consumptive use of water, but it is. There's a certain amount of water that's lost from evaporation when we build dams and use it for hydropower. Biofuels require power, and frankly, a lot of countries haven't begun to tap into those energy resources either. And then municipal demands, and that gets more into getting the water to the right locations, because we're going to have 60% of the population will be in an urban type setting. We're going to have to get the water to fewer locations and more of it. So, resiliency of water treaties are certainly going to be tested, and some people have predicted that they're not strong enough and that they will fail. This is a quote by Peter Glick. Existing agreements and international principles for sharing water will not adequately handle the strain of future pressures, particularly those caused by climate change. Oops. See, I had another quote I wanted to. No, I don't see it. So whether or not they fail or not, it's not as complicated, not as simple as saying they're going to have less water, therefore these treaties are a fail. We've already talked about how there's all kinds of factors that go into that determination. They certainly will be stressed, however. Okay, I'm going to skip that one. So, as part of my dissertation, I actually looked at some of these treaties and looked at the number of conflict, or I guess what I'm calling them complaints, that happen within these basins. And then I also took those complaints and then determined if they were climate-related complaints or if they were just anything else, any other kind of complaint that went along. And there was 85 events of the 400 that I looked at that were actually climate-related complaints. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of basins that actually did have climate-related complaints, and talk about how that related to the strength of that treaty in particular. We already talked about some of the stresses that could lead to conflict, but I wanted to point out also that perceptions are sometimes more important than the actual water itself. How people view that and whether they think that water is going to be less can cause people, spur them to action and cause people to care more about water than they might have otherwise. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Indus Water Treaty. And I'm also going to talk about, after this, I'm going to talk about the Nile. And actually, let me go back just one. So I'm going to talk about those two treaties. Rapid environmental change, check. Rapid population growth, asymmetric economic growth, yep, got that too. Unilateral development projects, Internationalization of a basin, certainly within the Nile. And I guess you could also say that Afghanistan and the developments that are going there, it's almost that. So Indus Water Treaty. A couple of the major stressors that are going on with the Indus Water Treaty are, well, let me go back a little bit. The Indus Water Treaty is really a unique treaty just because it separates the 6 major tributaries for the Indus, just as a quick background. And I think it's the only treaty that I can think of where those tributaries, full allocation pretty much is given to another country. Can you think of another treaty where there's, I think that's the only treaty that I can think of where, so the western tributaries are given to Pakistan, and the eastern ones are given to India. The stresses, the environmental stresses are significant, and these are across the basin. But the real party that's worried about these stresses is Pakistan. Pakistan relies on the Indus much more heavily than India does. India uses it primarily for water power, for hydropower, but Pakistan uses it for a broad range of things. So the Indus Water Treaty. Also, one other thing about the Indus Water Treaty is just generally considered as the strongest and most successful and probably the most important treaty, water treaty out there. And it has been successful. It's been through, I don't know how many different wars. People have still connected and worked their way through it. But there are some new stresses that are coming along those lines. So I looked at the complaints that had been filed there. There was 110 complaints, but only 4 were related to climate. So climate issues per se haven't really been as much of a factor there. Much more important within the Indus, just the overall political situation and how people utilize the water that definitely has a visceral and sometimes a spiritual aspect to it. Use that for the political environment. What I also thought what was really interesting about the Indus was, sure, it's a transnational, transboundary treaty, but it certainly impacts subnational issues as well. Some treaties, when they consider scale, they consider all the way up from sometimes the individual all the way up to the people, the nations that are party to that treaty. So key international drivers right now are pretty much Afghanistan coming into play as far as developing the Kabul River. They're not a party to the treaty. And also Indian development projects that talk about here, especially kind of kicked off, there were some issues before, but pretty much kicked off with the Bagliyar Dam. I'm pretty sure everybody has had some exposure to the Bagliyar, but so the Bagliyar ruling was caused India to, or caused Pakistan to be a little bit more worried about the Indus Water Treaty than perhaps it had been in the past. It gave India a little bit more leeway. It's not just black and white with the development of those tributaries. And right now, the Bagliyar went up to one level of arbitration within the treaty, and now with another dam, the Kishinganga Dam, that is going up actually to the highest level of arbitration that is available within the treaty. So things have been escalating within the Indus. The Bagliyar Dam basically came down to whether or not you can impound water behind the dam. India says, no, it's not big enough. There's not going to be any impoundment behind it. Pakistan disagreed, and so they took it to they had a neutral expert that decided on this, and the expert said, well, you pretty much, with minor modifications, you need to decrease the spillway levels and a couple other things. Said, India, you can go ahead and build that dam. Of course, does India then says, yes, we can build the dam. We succeeded. And what does Pakistan say? Yes, he said that India was in the wrong and they had to decrease. So they both claimed that they were successful. So in the embassy here said, cleared by neutral expert, stating that the overall design being built by India as a run-of-river plant has been upheld by the expert. And then Pakistan says, the He made it clear that the verdict India has been found guilty of breaching the Indus Water Treaty of 1960s. In reality, my opinion is that Pakistan is much less sure of that than they state there, and actually they're worried about it. They're really worried about it because what does it do? It allows India to take this template now that does indeed have a small amount of reservoir behind it, and they can start cranking these out. You know, they can have 10, 12 dams. It's already been decided that this is an acceptable design, and India is probably going to take advantage of that. This is just a Google Earth. This is a Google Earth shot here. This is the Bagliara. It's all done now. It's fully operational. This is a Google Earth shot though that shows exactly the ravine that we're talking about. I think this is about 500 meters. It's really a narrow ravine. This is like about 700 meters all the way up here. There's really no place for a huge reservoir to exist. However, you know, during the Indus flooding, that certainly didn't stop the Pakistani press from saying, Bagliara Dam is releasing water. That's why we're getting the flooding down here. So while it just didn't have the capacity, the perception was there, and it had already been made an iconic figure for people to refer to. So this is the Kishinganga. This is the one that's going before the Court of Arbitration right now. The basic idea is so you have the Kishinganga River, which is it's the Neelum. When it crosses over into Pakistan, it becomes the Neelum River. So what they want to do here is they want to divert water from the Kishinganga River down to the Wular Barrage right here, or the Wular Lake, and then come back into where they have a hydropower plant here, and then eventually it goes back into the Jhelum River. So if you look at this is where the plant will be. It'll go through the mountains here, hydro plant right about here, then comes back down into the Jhelum. I think they're about 50% done. That's where I think it's at, and it's supposed to be completed in 2014. So the Neelum Jhelum Dam wouldn't be a problem normally, but we have. Let's see. So here's the Kishinganga. So they're diverting. India wants to divert water down here so that it then comes in and hits the Jhelum right here. Well, right there is where this Neelum Jhelum Dam is, and so the water will not actually be available for that particular dam at that particular location. So what we have is we have a $4 billion project, $2 or $4 billion project being built by Pakistan, which if India's gets into place, then the water won't be available for both of them. So it's really interesting because there's a prior appropriation and it's pretty much going to be a race to decide who finishes first, and they'll have the higher standing within the Court of Arbitration. So this is what the Neelum Jhelum is going to look like. They're a little bit less further along. They're projected to be done about 2016. So good thing about water projects is it's not like it's a turtle race. You know, it's not like necessarily, oh my goodness, where did that dam come from? It takes a while. It gives people some time to figure things out. So the Indus Water Treaty, very strong treaty. We looked at all the different parameters. Very strong treaty. More than capable of handling most stresses. Actually, what was interesting as far from a climate change perspective is that it's actually very weak and doesn't have very many flood management capabilities built into it. And we saw some of those issues during the flooding last year. And so what does climate change say? The models generally say that overall they're going to have plenty of water, but your variability is going to change. You need some flood management capabilities in there, at least until all of the glaciers finish melting. Then you might have some availability issues there as well. Do I have time for one more? Or? Okay, I'm just going to zip through the Nile because there's not a lot going on there. Wow. I think we're all familiar with the Nile Treaty itself, so I'm just going to get into the stresses, the current stresses right now. So the CFA, has been signed and is being put forward for ratification by the countries, which actually is going to threaten the 1959 treaty, if signed. Threaten meaning that there will be more people involved with the treaty rather than just Egypt and Sudan. The problem with the CFA from an Egypt perspective is they want those allocations built into that treaty that preserve their rights to what they get now. And the other countries are not necessarily willing to do that. Another stress that's going on within the basin, South Sudan, you just internationalize the basin, you just got another riparian. How is that going to impact things? Global security, you know, when you're talking about, food security, a lot of countries are starting to buy up land within the basin and utilize it for their own food production purposes. A lot of these are, you know, theoretical and actually haven't been, you know, applied yet, but possibly. Development. I think, you know, with some of these other stresses that are going on with the Arab Spring up in Egypt, some of these upstream countries and with the CFA are thinking, hey, it's time for us to start plowing ahead. So the Millennium Dam is one that's being put forward in Ethiopia. I'll talk about that in just 1 second, really fast. And then also population. So started off being called the Border Dam, then it started being called Project X, went to Millennium Dam, and now I think it's at the Renaissance Dam. So if nothing else, this is not only going to be the biggest dam in Africa, it's also going to be the most named dam and the longest named dam in Africa. But it's a huge project, 4.8 billion. It's going to be twice the size of Lake Tana right here as far as from a volume perspective. And it's going to send Ethiopia's power production through the roof. Whether or not they can pull it off, it's, you know, that's a lot of money for Ethiopia. But I think, again, it goes into the whole, you know, political side of things. What are they using this for? Are they really going to build it, or does it tie into the overall water picture? I'll skip that. Okay. So my conclusions, as you know, I've looked at some of these case studies and applied this, is that water is definitely part of the, you know, larger security picture. Is it just about the water? No, it ties into a lot of different things. The treaty itself and what it ties itself into actually impacts how important that treaty is. Does a treaty tie itself to agriculture, hydropower, industry, potable water, political relations? If it does, that increases the importance of that particular treaty. If it doesn't, it's not applied as much, and people are probably less likely to actually complain about it. Not all conflict is bad. Not all cooperation is necessarily good. I don't know how many of you are married, but there's conflict and there's cooperation, and it's part of a healthy relationship. And so sometimes you have these what we would call complaints and failed treaties, but in reality that's success. That's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to solve those complaints, as long as it doesn't go beyond that level. And then the last point I wanted to make was that the solutions that we're talking about here are often static within the treaty, but we have these shifting problems. And so when we have that flexibility built within these treaties, it allows it to be a living, breathing, an important part of solving those problems.
Well, thanks to all three of you. You've given us a lot to look at. You've all obviously done an awful lot of research and work on this to have it apply and plug into a great number of kind of policy debates at different levels in different parts of the world, and concerns for folks with different portfolios as reflected by who we have in the room. So why don't we go to a discussion. We're going to need to return that handheld to Jason back there in the right-hand corner, or whoever I stole it from, Jimmy. Just stole it from Jimmy over there. But who would like to kick us off with first some questions to start? Well, here, why don't I can hand this one to you, and we'll pick up maybe a couple and then give you guys a chance to respond.
Yeah, Captain Assistant Manager, you all three talk about water here. It's water in the river. But since nowadays, the world is intensified urbanization. If we did not properly manage all this groundwater, would that be the big problem in the future? Thank you.
Okay, yep, the groundwater one obviously jumps out. There are other questions or comments, so we can get a few in together. Maybe just right over here, Chaitanya, if you can hand it to Ed.
Hi.
It's all the way at the bottom.
Got it? There we go. Hi, Ed Carr, USAID. Couple, I guess, kind of linked questions for you. And Matt started to get at some of this, and so it pulls around. I mean, treaties are, of course, only as good as people's willingness to honor them. That's your first issue to deal with. And so when we're talking about, one of the things I'm interested in is you're talking about when the rate of change exceeds the institution's capacity to absorb that change. It seems to me that, like, how that change is going to be absorbed matters greatly. Because you're not going to get a win-win situation for everybody, right? These kind of treaties require trade-offs, and those trade-offs, it seems to me, not only play out internationally, but within the signatory countries. So have you been looking at how these treaties then may, you know, cascade out into different kinds of stresses within the signatory countries that might cause these institutions to lose capacity over time to absorb this?
Okay. Other. Yeah, right there in the middle. Sorry.
Hi, Becky Blanchard at the State Department. My perspective is primarily from the fisheries world, and we often find that some of the best treaties on paper are often the ones that aren't really implemented well. And so following on the previous question, you know, to what extent do you look at the performance of the parties in executing treaties, and what kinds of metrics do you find useful?
Why don't we take those three and give you guys a chance to divide and conquer?
An easy one.
No.
I'll take a first crack and pass it on. So groundwater, you're absolutely right. Groundwater, I think, not just me, UNESCO, the International Law Committee at the United Nations, everybody's recognizing that this is uncharted territory, almost literally. ILC is trying to craft a new, the groundwater equivalent of the 1997 Convention on Transboundary Freshwater. And they're having, I think, a tough time of it because groundwater is really tough. It's complicated scientifically. It's complicated for a lot of different reasons. But I think the importance can't be understated. When we're talking about, for example, North China Plain, we're talking about a period where farmers were being encouraged to drill wells to expand their agriculture, and then the water table drops, and then suddenly you have whole vast swaths of the region running out of water, which is driving people to move to the cities that don't have the infrastructure to absorb them. So this is the kind of thing that I think we'll see more and more of. In treaties, they're really badly handled. There's only, depending on how you count, 5% or 16%, Jim, of the treaties even mention groundwater, and those that do don't do a very good job of dealing with it. So I absolutely agree with the question or the comment that it's the coming issue, and I think a lot of folks are starting to look and deal with it. Question of implementation. I want to divide out what we did here and what it may or may not be useful for. When we're doing these kind of global overviews, it's basically to kind of flag areas that you might look at closer, and that's it. We can't from here test implementation. We can't test effectiveness. But what we do, and I was really happy. We're part of something called it's a consortium of universities on transboundary waters, and we did a global overview of kind of different sets of vulnerabilities, and then we have a partner on each continent that then went into a lot of the basins and had kind of the case studies that were both positive and negative. And I would point to that. So five volumes, one for each continent with transboundary waters, and it was done by UNEP. And it's on our website and downloadable for free. When we get the chance to look carefully, I think the most important treaties tend to be pretty resilient. people don't back out of treaties very easily and very, very readily. So if we think about even the Johnston negotiations, which wasn't even ratified. It was an agreement that nobody ever signed, and yet it was held for 40 years, and then it was the basis of the water components of the Israel-Jordan peace talks. I think here the Indus is another really good example, is the Indus laid out kind of three stages of conflict resolution, and every now and again, some politician on some side says, "Oh, we're getting screwed by the treaty. We have to back out of the treaty," and then the water people go and do what they're supposed to do, work within the treaty and resolve the issue within. So a lot of times the rhetoric swirling around backing out is political rhetoric. And so I always distinguish, if I'm trying to get a handle on what's going on in a basin, I always ask, you always know what the politicians are saying because that's in the newspaper. I always ask what the water people are saying. And you oftentimes get very, very different sets. There was water wars on the Israel-Lebanon border. There's a pipe about 3 inches in diameter, and all the water people knew nobody was going to war over this pipe. But of course, the politicians on both sides were having a field day. So I think that when we get the chance to look carefully, I think they turned out to be very resilient over time. Now, as Mark Zeitoun and the School of London has pointed out, sometimes what's embedded in the treaty, and you allude to this, what's embedded in the treaty is inequitable. And that's what treaties do. Sometimes they solidify disproportionate power relations or who wasn't in the room, and sometimes there's a way to deal with that, sometimes there's not. An area close to home, those of us who were involved in the Columbia Basin, signed in 1964, really good treaty as long as you're only looking at hydropower and flood control. Didn't deal with, tribal rights, because at the time they had no standing, didn't deal with fish, didn't deal with public participation. So what's embedded in the treaty is really, really good. And now that some of the components are coming up to lapse, we're getting a chance to go back at it and say, okay, now let's incorporate these values that have changed over the last 50 years.
Well, I think that you're going to have the above the table type discussions that are going to be, treaties stand for cooperation, treaties stand for we're gonna play nice with our neighbors, but then everybody's going to do exactly what they can to further their own interests, and if they can manipulate and use those treaties, they're going to. That's why I think within the treaty, if you can have a flexible, adaptable treaty, that's probably the most important thing, because then you can change things to fit the surroundings and the needs. But it's really interesting to me that there is no design handbook for a treaty out there that says this is how you build a treaty. These are important things. There's a lot of ideas that says, oh, within the Indus they did this or they did this over there, but no real empirical evidence that says this is important. This is what happened across a broad range of treaties so that you can apply it in a general sense.
There's a question over on the side. If we get that one, and then definitely wave, because it's okay. Cynthia's got one. So, sir, if you go ahead.
Yeah, Jonathan Cook from the World Wildlife Fund. So actually just following up that last point, which I think is a very interesting one, are there plans in the next, I guess, phase of this work to dive down into these, I'd say, kind of criteria of what makes a treaty in itself resilient or adaptive? I think this is something that we're actually quite interested in some work that we're doing. In other words, a treaty may be a proxy for something at a certain level of abstraction, but of course the devil may be in the details in terms of whether it's an effective mechanism. And so, you hinted just now that one principle that might be common to adaptive treaties is how flexible they are. Are they something that can be revisited, reopened? Are there options for incorporating data as it becomes available? So I'm wondering if there's any more plan to look at that level of principles or common themes. Thanks.
Cynthia?
Thanks. Cynthia Brady with USAID's Conflict Office. Thank you all for your presentations. Bear with me while I try to articulate my question clearly. I think it was in Jim's presentation that you showed the various components that you all were using to calculate the aspects of institutional resilience, including things like the presence of conflict resolution mechanisms, et cetera. So what I'm wondering is, have you already done the analysis, or do you intend to do the analysis to try to draw sort of comparisons about which aspects of institutions have the strongest correlations to incidents of cooperation or risk of, in particular, conflictive events? Is that the sort of question and the level of prioritization that you can get to, while still recognizing what Aaron mentioned, that this is, you know, a global comparison which has limitations? Thanks.
Julian, you have a question down here front, then we'll get the one in the back. Oh, I guess we'll go to the back first, and then we'll come back to Julian. Go ahead.
I'm Kanya de Almeida from the Interpress Service, and I was curious, while discussing the strengthening of institutional capacity and treaties, I feel that that would then fall into the realm of sort of government-controlled management. And I'm wondering what happens, or what you think should happen, when a government in power is at odds with sort of the demands and the calls of indigenous, local, native communities, and what can be done to strengthen the capacity of local groups that exist outside of the government realm or jurisdiction when there's a conflict between those parties.
Okay, why don't we take those, and then Jimmy, if you can bring it to Julian here, and then we have one over there too.
Thanks. I want to start with this last one first, because it's really, really interesting. That international relations, by definition, fall to national governments. But the question is really interesting. It's, if these are national governments, how do you incorporate the really important local values that get embodied? And there have been some really neat ways of doing this. There's well, at a local level, for example, in India, on a lot of the tributaries, right on river basin organizations, the stakeholders include people who own land within the basin, and the legal landowner in a lot of the places of temples is the deity to which the temple is dedicated. And so the local religious communities actually have a representative in the deity, represented by somebody from the temple, to sit on the River Basin organization, which is really interesting. A lot of local communities have, I mean, local river basin authorities often have somebody from green NGOs, from business, from people who aren't involved in the government. But even at the international level, it's I want to say the Scheldt River. Anybody from the area? Okay, good, so I can talk about it with confidence. I think it's the Scheldt on the basin the International River Basin Organization. Each of the countries is represented, but there's also a representative from a green NGO that represents the interests of the river itself. So that and since all agreements are done by consensus, the river has to agree to whatever decision making gets done on its behalf. So there are really, I mean, when we look around the world, there are really exciting ways that people, I think even more formally, the Nile Basin Initiative has kind of two tracks. There's the official government-to-government track, and then there's this whole network established by the initiative of NGOs that also, by design, play into the management. So I think it's a great question, and we're asking it on the Columbia because, you know, 50 years we've been outside the room, and a lot of us want to get back in the room. So take that question first. Come back to what are the parameters of a good treaty? My own sense is every basin's unique. Gilbert White said this. He's way more famous than me and said it long before I did. But what we do best is think about these in terms of tools in a toolbox. So things that work, you know, we talk about general principles like polluter pays, right? Well, sometimes it doesn't work. You know, the polluter doesn't necessarily have the money to pay, and if somebody else has the money, is willing to pay, like we do, we fund, the U.S. pays for sewage treatment in Mexico because we want the sewage treated because the water flows our way. So these kind of general global principles, I think, don't necessarily work. So the kinds of things that tend to work in treaties are mechanisms for adaptation. When values change, is there a way to adapt? And that can happen formally. U.S. agreements have what are called minutes. The U.S. treaties have minutes that you can adapt, you can add things that changed. So Niagara Falls in its day was for hydropower. Niagara River Treaty was for hydropower. Then we boosted hydropower during World War II, and then we realized that we can make, after World War II, we can make more money with tourism. So now the treaty actually calls for most of the river to flow during daylight summer hours so that the tourists have something to see, and then they turn off the river at night when nobody's looking. So the ways that to deal with adaptation, for representation, for all the things that you'd expect, prior notification. In one of our articles, we actually go down and list the things, the types of things that tend to be useful in some settings. How do you measure effectiveness is another nightmare. And I tend to think in terms of three sets of impacts. I think of the biophysical impacts. So a treaty can be good in protecting the environment. A treaty can be good in geopolitical impacts. It can mitigate for conflict. And sometimes it can do one and not the other, right? Lake Chad, people get along great, and the ecosystem's gone to hell, right? Biophysical, geopolitical, and socioeconomic. And so if you look at each of those three, you can actually measure the impacts of a basin. Is that work being done? Yes. Lucia Di Stefano, who was the lead on this study, is taking a lot of this data with Shlomi Dinar, who's a scholar at Florida International University, and they're going and trying to connect the treaty stuff that we've pulled out here with the event data to see can you really see statistically whether different parameters actually have different impacts. And actually Matt did a lot of that on his own dissertation as well. Which you want to talk about?
Do we have a couple hours?
The dissertation, just a plug, it's coming out, watch for his name. It's going to be published by Springer like imminently, so keep your eye out for that.
1795.
Not if it was Springer.
Not Springer, not Springer. 1700.
That's right,
I did want to just say one quick thing. You mentioned an effective tree and how you define. Well, what is an effective tree? It just depends on what you define. Yeah. What do you use your criteria of success? Is it complaints? Is it making sure that everybody gets enough water? I mean, there's a lot of different things that you can use as a definition of criteria. What I used was complaints. What I thought was interesting was, if you define a successful treaty as not having as many complaints, then the most important factors were scale. If you had a lot of people involved and you looked at a lot of different people, it actually was a less successful treaty because there was more complaints. If you had better communication, not a successful treaty because it leads to more complaints. So. And then obviously enforcement was the other one, but that one kind of makes sense. It leads to more complaints. But those are all important things for a successful treaty. But if you define it that way, then it would appear as not being successful.
Good, Julian, and then over here.
Julian Kachanoff. I'm with the Department of State's water team, and this may have been covered under, I guess, what Mr. Di Stefano, I guess you alluded to his work with her. Sorry, my apologies.
She.
To her work on sort of biophysical aspects, but in terms of sort of next steps, I noticed in the components of these treaties, only 16% or something in that range actually dealt with the environment. And since rivers offer more services than just a pipeline for water, is there perhaps for a next step an idea of plotting populations who are dependent on some of those environmental services? Because I know that, for example, in areas like the Mekong, it's more than just water that's important. And also, this latest installment of your work dealt with climate change impacts, but rate of change in terms of development impacts, is that something that you're looking at as well? So, thanks.
Just to answer very quickly, part of what your question relates to how we define the treaties that we collect. We define them by water resources. So somehow water has to be a component that's dealt as a specific commodity in there. So there's a whole host of environmental agreements that we don't capture at all, that we just don't. And I'd refer you to, there was a really good paper by Mark Giordano in a geography journal where he did the same thing with broader environmental treaties and specifically ones that had wildlife involved. And there's a guy at University of Oregon whose name I can't remember right. This isn't being webcast, is it?
Mm.
Yeah. whose name I have right here on the, and I'll show you later on the piece of paper. So if you're looking more broadly, that's where you'd look. The rates of change, you're right, here we're looking at climate. The other rates of change we looked at in the first basins at risk analysis, I don't think a lot of that has changed in countries in relationship to each other. So countries that had high GDP in 2003 generally have high GDP now. And so I don't know that, but we're anxious now. I mean, we can look at all this data at a much finer scale. We're anxious to redo the whole thing, is to really look at all the different things, all the different changes in a basin, and we can do it, I think we can do it better, faster.
Yes, my name is Jerry Hush, and I'm with Climate Action Intelligence. We're a consulting company working with UNDP. And I have a question because I'm really fascinated by the switch that you did and the focus on treaties, in essence, which has a lot to do with the process of writing the treaties. Are you mapping the key actors involved with the writing of the treaties? For example, we've discovered that it could be the Ministry of the Environment in one country, but it could be the Ministry of Mines and a whole variety of different key actors within the governments.
That's a really interesting question. We don't. We should.
We are.
We'll talk.
We'll talk.
It's all about making links.
Yeah.
I think at the end of the table, I think it's hard to see, but I think.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hi, Juliet Piper with Climate Wire. I was wondering if you could talk more about the climate change issue in general. I know it was referred to, but in the places that are predicted to be at risk, I guess, of more conflict, what do the current treaties there have in place to mitigate those potential risks, or what should they have in place? What is the sort of level of danger we're looking at here in those areas?
And can I add to that, and in part, Aaron, from our previous conversations about perhaps talking about the importance of variability as a means to both take on the challenges that you pointed out are here today, that climate change is and or will exacerbate and bring greater both variability, but the advantages of using the variability frame to be able to talk about existing problems, about what climate means for it, and also dodge some of the, or deal with, not dodge, deal with some of the uncertainties and the challenges of attribution of climate impacts versus other kind of just straight variability.
You want to take the first crack at that? No. So part of the problem with all this is everybody in the room, I'm sure, is aware, is separating out what's climate and what's just everyday suffering. And so there's a lot of just everyday suffering going on. There's, population exceeds the resources that are there. There's, half the world doesn't have access to sanitation. 2.5 to 5 million people die every year. Lack of access to water. This is now. This is current. And what we're looking at specifically here is this question of variability, floods and droughts. And floods and droughts are causing horrific suffering around the world today. We know that through a variety of mechanisms, one, more and more people living in floodplains, or more and more people relying on water, and two, the impacts of climate change, that both the variability is likely to increase and the impacts are likely to increase. So what our thinking is if we can help deal with that variability, think about how do we deal with that variability institutionally now, we can help address some of these issues now and also be readier for as all of these problems exacerbate. So these can be as simple as on the Mekong River Commission, talking about flood control. just the simple fact that the Mekong River only recently has a notification between flows in China and potential impacts downriver, that's hugely important. That's hugely important now, and will continue to be important as the impacts of climate change are felt in the Himalayas. In our part of the world, in the Pacific Northwest, we're seeing less snow, more rain. What does that mean in terms of our security is that we've counted for decades on the snowpack to pretty much store our water for free. And if more falls earlier, when we don't need it, we need that water later during the irrigation season. If more of the water falls earlier, it does a couple of things. It melts the snow and creates higher peaks in our floods earlier. And we don't have the infrastructure to deal with that. So for the first time in 30 or 40 years, people all along the West, from California, think of these states, California, Washington, Oregon, are for the first time talking about big dams again. Haven't done that for years and years. And as this happens around the world, we know that dams done badly are themselves causes of conflict. So all of these things end up linked in a way that it's worth really thinking about how do we deal with current variability, and how can we help in all of our efforts, whether it's modeling or mitigation or adaptation or institutions, to deal with variability now with the hope that we can help mitigate the exacerbated impacts in the future. That's fair.
Okay. Yes, we have a question down here. And again, just wave because it's hard to see with so many folks. Okay, great. Over there. Oh, hey, David.
Hi, I'm Joan Aaron. I'm a consultant. I also spent recently a couple of years at EPA as a AAAS policy fellow. And following up from what relates to your last point where you were talking about within the U.S., I was wondering, have you, obviously the transboundary issue here, it's implicit in that as you're talking about two different countries. I was wondering, has there been discussion, analysis, like within country and sort of sharing lessons? And the one that comes to mind that I was involved with some discussions is what happened in the United States Southeast a couple of years ago, and is still involving around the Atlanta area and the 3 states around there. You know, it's not transboundary in the sense of different countries, but boy, it generated and still continues to generate a lot of dispute about how that water is going to be shared in that basin because it crosses state boundaries. And are those, I was just wondering, do you consider those, where are the lessons learned? What's fundamentally different about nations versus these kinds of issues of sharing across other kinds of boundaries?
Thank you so much. Not only is that a great question, but it gives me the chance to show off that I actually know the 2 river systems you're talking about, which is a big deal because one is the Alabama-Coosa-Tallapoosa and the other is the Appalachicola-Chattahoochee-Flint. Thank you. 5 years at the University of Alabama, by God. So yeah. We had 15 minutes here. We have a whole other section of our research that's Western U.S. primarily, but basically what we find in common is this relationship between change and institutions. So there, we're talking about an area that gets 90 inches of rain a year. Really, you're going to have water conflict? But that's the point, is that people use water differently in different climates for different things. So in that part, it's shrimp in the bay. It's farming all along the stretch in Alabama and Georgia. It's drinking water in Atlanta, and it's transportation. So one of these ideas that arid places are naturally more conflictive is blown away precisely because of this kind of example. And I did, when I was at the University of Alabama, worked on this issue and got the chance to weigh in. In the Western U.S., it's interesting. We've done these event databases for both the state of Oregon and for the upper Colorado, and the ratio turns out to be the same no matter where you look. 2/3 of the time we do anything about water, it's cooperate. There's almost no explicit violence specifically about water resources. And that's true. And what else is true? If you know one basin in Oregon, it's a geography quiz. What basin would you know? Klamath. the Klamath Basin, because it's the one that blew up, right? You don't know about the Umatilla, you don't know about the Walla Walla, you don't know about the Grand Ronde, where people are quietly working together, bringing all these different stakeholders in with all of their competing interests to have very healthy conversations about joint management. The one interesting thing that we did find in the western U.S., we looked at this relationship between change in institutions and found also drought was not an indicator of conflict. It was sudden institutional change. And the biggest institutional change that created a setting that was conflictive were sudden legal changes, sudden changes to the law, like a new endangered species or a new requirement for the agricultural community, where suddenly everybody has to manage their water resources differently. And so the lesson for us, and we did this work with the Bureau of Reclamation, so they were moderately interested, was that it's not only about getting more water to more people, it's also about having better conversations earlier before that change happens. If you know an endangered species is on the table, start having the conversation like the Klamath. What if you'd had a conversation that said, let's talk about the sucker, let's talk about tribal rights, let's talk about reclamation rights, and let's talk about a drought. What is our plan when all of this stuff happens? If we'd had that conversation in 1990, 1999 wouldn't have looked as bad as it did.
Okay, David Mickle.
David Mickle with the Stimson Center. You've talked in great and fruitful detail about variability on the biophysical side, or variability in the institutional setting, say, surrounding the treaty mechanism. So an additional player like South Sudan, or an additional legal requirement like an endangered species. But I wonder if you've gotten a sense about addressing variability within the treaties themselves. So that Jim talked about thinking not in terms of individual accords, but a regime of instruments. So you have the framework treaty and then a protocol or an amendment. And whether you've got a feeling for how to go about making those additions or changes or adding to the variability of the regime itself in order to address the looming pressures or the existing pressures. So when you're looking at those statistics and seeing that only 16% of the basin units are covered by a complete multilateral treaty, how do you add Afghanistan to the Indus Treaty? When you're looking at and seeing that only 2.6% of those treaties have something about stakeholder participation, and yet stakeholder participation is the sine qua non of integrated water resources management, right? So how do you get all those stakeholders into the room? What can you do in the treaty itself or around the treaty itself to add those features that you're finding are helpful to address the variability?
From a policy side, I'll leave that to Aaron. I mean, the nice thing about from the data framework side, we actually can start to look at that, like when are things added, and we can start to correlate that with a bar scale to say, do you see these bumps in conflict over time if you start adding new components to treaties, or if you, so we have this information both temporally and spatially and content-wise. We can start to investigate how instruments evolve over time if those variations themselves were to drive some other events externally. So yes, it is possible to look at, and I think would be interesting to look at. Did you want to talk about that?
You know, I just think that there's a lot that really goes into that. I think it would be interesting to see exactly, what kind of variability has been within the treaty, but whether or not it's, actually applied within the treaty. There's so many factors that go into that. I mean, within Afghanistan, you've got 8 different ministries that are looking at water with nobody who has any real, authority to say or do anything without talking to all the other ones. So there's no somebody in charge to actually, take control of that treaty. So I think it would be interesting to see what the results of that were, but whether or not it had been implemented or not, what factors go into that, that's a really tough question to ask.
But see, Matt, in looking at that stuff, you're supposed to make the recommendation yourself. You're supposed to say, this is how we bring Afghanistan into the treaty. Be proactive about it.
Yes.
Yes.
I'll send you the memo.
I think it's tough what you're talking about. I think a lot of the problem is that we assume mostly kind of Western and Northern European values need to be incorporated in a lot of these things. And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. I don't know necessarily that all international treaties have to have public participation on a daily basis. I think it's useful to have mechanisms for that. But there is a truism, as a lot of folks here know, is the more people in the room negotiating, the less it says. And I think that's true of multilateral treaties also. As you look at the treaties that cover large swaths of multilateral basins, they generally say less than really focused bilateral treaties. And I don't know that it's necessarily a bad thing. If we look at the Jordan, for example, the Jordan is covered entirely, but only by bilateral treaties. Right? So Lebanon and Syria have an agreement, Syria and Jordan have an agreement, Jordan and Israel have an agreement, Israel and the Palestinians have an agreement. And the whole basin is covered. Right? But if you sat around and waited for the Syrians and Israelis to walk into the room together, we'd still be waiting here, 50 years later. And I don't know that the Jordan is managed collectively any better or worse than any other basin in the world. There is somehow communication amongst the basin as a whole. So this kind of idea that the entire basin needs to be covered under one system, I think as long as there's coordination of what happens at the border, quality, quantity, timing, what happens at the border, that's important. But beyond that, I don't know that multilateral agreements in multilateral basins are necessarily better. China, for example, right now is not part of the Mekong River Commission. And I don't know necessarily what it would bring if they were. What they are doing is increasingly being willing to share information, to share their plans, to share their data. And I don't know necessarily what would happen. I mean, this is a community of pretty small, poor countries. If all of a sudden China walks into the room, the dynamics in that room change profoundly. And when I say I don't know, I really mean that. I really mean I don't know. But I do know enough to be suspicious to think it by definition would be a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yep, question over here.
Thanks. Christopher Krause from the National Environmental Education Foundation. When is it time for a new treaty, and what are some treaties around the world that you think need to go and new treaties need to be established? You can get some examples.
Yeah. So I mean, I want to come back to a point that Jim made. A lot of bad treaties get modified, and that's what's important. So right now in the Columbia, we're really kind of weighing the transaction cost of an entirely new treaty, or how much of the ethics that we've now developed, how much can we incorporate within a new treaty? One of the worst treaties is, most people know, is the Colorado Basin, right? Just rip-roaring does everything wrong. And somehow, over time, it's been modified. It still does a lot of things wrong, but there are mechanisms for modifying it. And so I think that's the question: is where would you modify agreements? And I think there's a host of those. The Colorado definitely is one. The fact that water doesn't make it to the sea, that's kind of a problem if you're a fish, right? So I think in the Caucasus, a lot of kind of Soviet-era agreements that were in place. The Ural Sea, for example, is a mess. I think, and again, I think we have to kind of define, what do we mean by mess? Is it a geopolitical mess? Is it a biophysical mess? Is it a socioeconomic mess? And you can find places where there's each of those. And then this comes back to your question: is then how do you incorporate the people that aren't there, the values that aren't there, or the and so. How would you identify those places? I think we made, on the geopolitical side, it's pretty easy to find places where there's conflicts, or as Matt's been finding, complaints about water. The geopolitical side's easy to find. The biophysical find is easy to find. There's, it's no shortage of degradation in the world. That's easy. And the socioeconomic piece, I think, also is fairly easy to find. That's how I would do it. I would go looking for each of those kinds of messes.
Give you a chance to be donor for a day. What would be at the top of your wish list if your charge was to increase resilience to anticipated variability due to climate change in transboundary river basins? Where would you put your chips?
Well, into universities. Of
Well,
course. More research, more research.
I almost told you that you wouldn't have to do that.
That's right.
I just assumed you'd have the good grace not to suggest more research.
You don't know me that well.
Yeah.
I think there's two sides. I mean, if we look at this kind of research, I think it's clear, and most international institutions are getting this and doing this. It's helping where you can to help craft resilience in institutions, and that oftentimes leads to side benefits in and of itself. When you're doing this, you're bringing in stakeholders, which generally are representative of a lot of different types of folks. So it's, you bring in the rancher and the environmentalist and the agriculturist, the city person, the priest, whoever it is who cares, into a room, and you're basically using water to talk about your shared vision of your future. And so that in and of itself is a useful exercise. But I got to kind of step out of the climate change and treaty world to say I think the biggest problem is that we don't have the political will to deal with the fact that half the world doesn't have access to sanitation and 1.5 billion people don't have access to drinking water. I think there's so much just flat out suffering because we don't have the political will to make these investments in simply getting water to the people and ecosystems that need it. That's where I would be making the investment.
Well, certainly. Yep, gentlemen, any? I mean, after that impassioned, it's tough to say, and yeah, this too. But we're at the end of our time. So on this question or any other questions, if folks would like to make any final remarks.
That was a good way to end it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we appreciate the passion. Certainly, there are programs and efforts to address those shortfalls. The small s, as Matt called them. But we appreciate the work that you've done, because it is certainly a lot of work. We appreciate you coming and sharing some very good questions from the audience. Appreciate that very much. Hope you will pick up some of the publications outside that will link you to Aaron and his colleagues' work. The World Bank report, I think, will be on the meeting summary and the video page, so you can get that directly. And then when the peer-reviewed piece comes out, we'll have a link to that as well. So thank you, gentlemen. Won't you join me in thanking our guests today?